So this is always a fun one for me here because, basically, Rocky Four is, one of the best sports movies ever, right? And we all know that, really, like it says here, athleticism is really king when it comes into sports, or queen. I don't want to leave the ladies out, right? So, but athleticism is the most important thing. So, through all this training stuff that we're trying to do, whether it's isokinetics or accommodating resistance or isotonic, whatever it is, PNF, all the things that we've been talking about, it's really to improve somebody's athleticism, right? So as we're improving somebody's function, we are improving their athleticism to some degree, right? So, and all of these things are going to improve athleticism. The reason I hit that home is because, and on one end, it's like, yeah, we want to be functional, but it should be taking us to, really another level of coordination in our bodies to be able to do more athletic things. The other side of it is that a lot of people, when they hear athletic, they think, oh, well, that's not for me, right? So it's a challenge to get that point across that as we progress and improve our function, that we need to move towards more athleticism. Even dancing, right? Dancing is a very functional, athletic type of movement that requires a lot of coordination. And even with some of my athletes, I tell them, I've told them over the years, I think maybe you should take a couple of days a week and just do some dancing. Make that a part of your supplemental conditioning type of thing. Helen Maroulis, the Olympic gold medalist wrestling athlete that I've worked with, she actually took up dance in the last couple of years to work on her athleticism. She goes to dance twice a week and does all these salsa dances and all this stuff, which is pretty cool. The Rocky Four Drago thing, right? Drago was using isokinetics, right? So that's what the point of this is. So when we first started out, when I was in Pittsburgh, a lot of people would say, oh, this is kind of like, Drago and Rocky are, meeting into one place, right? You guys do the real fancy, physiological stuff, but you're also doing some of this kind of dungeon style, training using kettlebells and club bells and the real hard functional stuff. But we also had this really scientific approach, and we had these isokinetic machines and using accommodating resistance. So I just love that. The other side of it is that we know Drago, they didn't shy away from this, and they show him sticking the needle right in his arm in the in the training montage, right? That famous scene from Rocky Four, and they were obviously using PEDs, which is the challenge when we get down to this side of it with isokinetics and all of this stuff, is trying to tease out what really works for everybody when a lot of this research has actually been done, across the board in sports, especially in these other countries with athletes that were on PEDs, right? So that makes a challenge. So one of the things that we know, coming back to that, typically in isokinetics, we're not really using eccentrics. There are some good research studies showing that eccentrics with isokinetics works very well for ACL injuries in terms of speeding up the rehab process. Like we said, isokinetics are great for EMG activity, and eccentrics are also great for EMG activity, so muscle recruitment. But in sports, right, the eccentric phase is always fast. Right? So when we go to throw, right, the arm comes back, boom, and we're going to go to throw real quickly. Or you throw a punch, the shoulder pulls back real quick, and boom, you're snapping that out. Or I like to think in wrestling, which is a sport where we do a lot of lifting, right? But when we lift somebody, we don't pick them up, sit them back down and lift them, right? We go into this position where we drop, and we call it a level change. You drop really fast and then boom, you explode back up, right? So in most sports, and arguably in all sports and all movements in sports, and really most of our functional movements, we don't really have a slow eccentric phase. And as we talked about before, we know that eccentrics cause a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness, both when you're working on fast and slow eccentrics. But again, you get this huge benefit of this neurological recruitment, and also you have a better connective tissue remodeling that goes on with it, as long as you're not doing the eccentrics excessively. So you have to be careful with that. You also have to be careful when you're getting into high speed eccentrics, especially with injuries, or like we were just talking about, if you haven't really done a fairly thorough evaluation on somebody, they may have deficits that you could put them in trouble by working on increasing the speed on the eccentric phase, right? So with this though, with isokinetics and using accommodating resistance, you're going to see 2 to 3 times faster results. And again, we got to remember that some of this data is skewed on working with the normal population. but we see it both in PT and some of the functional training as well. Especially again, this isn't just isokinetics. This is this idea of using accommodating resistance, which makes 100% sense because we're working on acceleration, and acceleration has more of a functional transfer than when we're seeing linear force production, or when we're going with isotonics or oxotonics, like we said before. But the rest of this is looking at what are the real advantages of using isokinetics, right? So like I kind of alluded to before, you can get near maximum force or torque production through your entire range of motion, right? Which it allows you to work through these weak angles with high force production, which anytime that you're using a weight, for example, you can't do this. So isokinetics has a huge benefit. You have a minimal warm-up period. So I was really lucky to get these machines early on. So I started playing with them, and we have this closed chain isokinetic machine, like I said. And I would, anytime, like still now when I demonstrate the ISO machine, I'm usually like showing somebody around and I'm like, hey, why don't you check this out? And I purposely do it without warming up, and I do it as hard as I can just to show them how little of risk there is with it, because you're only working on the concentric phase. Is there a risk? Of course there is, especially again, I could have been sitting in a chair for 3 hours, something could be kinked in my back or whatever, and I go to do it, and I would definitely be careful. I know my body well, but you don't have to warm up as much with this. So it allows for a shorter work period to do this, and ultimately also through the clinical side and in the working clinician side, sometimes that's a benefit in one way to go, okay, well, I don't have to do as much work with somebody. I can get them through this. They can do their strength training program, get the benefits from it, and we don't have to do as much, total volume and total time of work to see the benefit, which is our argument on the closed chain isokinetics. We believe we still see the same effects. I just am not going to say that to you guys right now, without any research. I believe that that's one of the biggest benefits for us with it because of the lack of the eccentric, muscle contraction. So again, ultimately that shortens the workouts. You also typically don't get any delayed onset muscle soreness or DOMS without having that eccentric phase when you're using the isokinetics. You will see that with the other forms of accommodating resistance with using the bands in the chains. In terms of like metrics tracking and testing and return to sports, it's a huge benefit to be doing isokinetics because you're getting objective data, right? You're getting this objective feedback, coming back to this evaluation-based protocol. It helps us to have these objective measurements. Like we talked about before, you don't need to use metrics to determine everything. There's also this qualitative subjective part that comes down to it as well, which if you look at the return to sports protocols, they actually do correlate that in with a subjective report of function in the athlete and going, well, how do you feel in terms of 100%? Well, I feel like I'm 60%. Well, at the same time, they're doing 100% of their force production and their hop tests and all of these things are perfect, but that athlete still doesn't have the confidence that they need to have. So you have to play on both sides. But probably one of the things I thought was the most interesting, and I actually just came across this, I didn't know this when I was doing the research for this in the last couple of months, was that you actually see a 15 to 20% increase when you use visual feedback. A lot of these machines will have, some type of like kind of force gauge measurement, digital readout on the computer. So you can actually see how much force or torque that you're creating. And when you use that, you actually see a 15 to 20% increase in the force production, which I thought was pretty cool, to understand. Now that